Let's examine quota implementation within Red Hat Enterprise Linux 6. This allows us to restrict the amount of storage that's consumed by users and or groups on the system. So let's label this section Quota Implementation. And features, of course, include the ability to limit storage consumption per user/group. Nowadays, storage is available in larger quantities than has been historically, and as a consequence is less of a concern. However, there are cases where it is still advantageous to consider the implementation of quotas with respect to busy systems that support a number of users, and to ensure that the storage is not depleted, resulting in system failure. So even if you've got terabytes of data, let's say amalgamated using LVM, if you don't impose limits, then users are likely to exceed those limits, especially in today's large storage requirement environments of multimedia, so videos, audio, etc. So it's still a good idea to place limits, even if the limits are large. So the ability to limit storage consumption per user/group is what quotas will allow us to do. And it does this based on disk block usage or inode usage. So based on disk block usage or inode usage, as when files are written to the disk, they occupy a certain number of disk blocks and inodes. So the ability to limit at a lower level is very important. If you recall, we've been looking at files with their inodes. So LSLI, for example, reflects the inodes that are in usage. So each file has an inode that's associated, and with quota management we can instruct the system to restrict the number of inodes that are allocated per user and or group. And similarly for blocks, files occupy blocks on the hard drive, so we can restrict as a consequence based on blocks. And blocks are of course associated with the files in a relationship that is relative to the size of the blocks that are defined when you define your file system, whether 4K, 8K, 16K, 32, 64, etc. So that'll determine the block allocation per user if you set limits based on blocks. And these limits can be imposed in two stages. So imposed in two stages: soft and hard. Soft limits may be exceeded. The soft limit is the initial threshold, so two stages or thresholds. And it may be exceeded for a grace period. And once the grace period has been realized, then the user is no longer able to consume any more storage. The hard limit is the absolute limit that may not be exceeded. So for example, a soft limit may be 100 blocks, a hard limit 150 blocks. So the user may exceed the 100 blocks for a grace period and not exceed the 150 blocks under any circumstances. So soft and hard. And perhaps we should just note, soft limit may be exceeded for up to the grace period. And obviously the hard limit may never be exceeded under any circumstance. So this gives you a window with which to operate. Now let's just note that in order to use quotas, you must have the quota RPM installed. So it requires the quota, and we'll just indicate an asterisk, as a wildcard, RPM. That can be confirmed quite simply by navigating to the shell as any user, even non-privileged. RPM query list, this dumps all of the packages that are available, query all on the system, and then list a particular package, quota for example, on the system. So if we grep the output into the following filter, we should see the quota package. So RPM query list quota, which is what we intended to do, enumerates the contents of the quota package. It's installed by default with your builds of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, so you should have it on your system. If not, use RPM or yum to install it before attempting to follow along with this section. So quota RPM must be installed. It is also enabled via the file system table file, fs tab. So in order to take advantage of the features provided by quotas, we first have to initialize or associate file systems with the user or group quota settings. So must associate file systems or system with quota management, either user or group, or both. Otherwise, quota management does not take place. So the first step for us is to associate quota management in etcfs tab. So let's set up our steps that are required to enable quota management. First, enable in etcfs tab. And we're going to set in this file both user and group quota management in the event that we'd like to use either or at any particular point. So we'll specify beyond the defaults section of any of the file systems that are of interest, user quota, group quota. Now we can begin by imposing quotas on the home file system, since the root file system is currently an independent file system. So impose on /home, as this is where we're concerned with limiting storage consumption. So let's take a look from the shell. We need to be root in order to perform this, of course. So in a root shell, we'll modify etcfs tab using nano, and we'll search for the home file system, which happens to be mapped to logical volume management. So notice for this particular entry that there is a single option defaults. This is where we'll tack on the user and group quota management options. So user quota, comma, grp quota. And we'll just bring everything back onto one line, just to be sure that everything remains on the line for parsing purposes. And we'll then need to remount the file system home in order for the quotas or quota management to take effect. So we've associated quota management with home in etcfs tab. The next step for us is to remount the file system, and that's /home. Now this may not necessarily be easy on a busy system, which is why quota management is a decision that should be taken perhaps prior to the publishing of your system or after having rebooted your system to single user mode. So this is an option that should take place prior to publishing your system to users. So effect quota management during single user mode / installation modes to avoid disconnects or interruptions in service, because it requires that the file system be remounted. So if other users are connected to your file system, perhaps via common services such as Samba, Apache, etc., then they're likely to experience a blip in connectivity to the file system. Now our system currently has no additional users connected. We can confirm that, of course, by using who or w commands that we've covered. So the command to remount will be simply mount with the option remount and a pointer to the file system to remount. So this remounts the file system. Optional ways of remounting the file system include unmounting and then mounting, or rebooting the system altogether. So let's just note, optional methods of remounting the file system include unmount or umount, mount, or reboot the system. So those are optional methods. To confirm connectivity from a shell, just execute W or who, and you'll see who's connected at any particular time. So here's a connection from root on the following IP address, or from the following IP address, 75.14. And the rest are Linux CBT connections, the pseudo terminals that we have open, including the existing pseudo terminal 0. So that's this connection. There's also one, which is possibly this connection. And since there are no files open in that window, that's okay. And in this window, pseudo terminal 10, which is reflected with no files open. And our documentation file, let's save it before we remount the home file system. May not even be a bad idea to close it all together. So those are the sessions that are open. So we'll trust that the root session that's open on 75 or from 75.14 currently has no documents open. But on your busy system, this is what you'll see if you execute who or W, the various sessions that are connected and using files from your system. So with that said, let's try to remount the home file system and continue down the road of quota exploration. So we'll give this a whirl, and we'll echo the exit status, and so far so good. So it seems to have run, and the test is to run mount to see whether or not the additional options, user quota and group quota, have been enabled appropriately. So they have been, at least for the /home file system. So let's just note, mount will reflect whether or not user quota /group quota options have been enabled. And in our case, it has reflected correctly. So that means we're now on our way to setting up user and group quotas. So the first step is to just remount the file system with the options set in etc fstab. When you remount the file system or mount the file system, fstab in etc or file system table is consulted. So that's why we had to make the change there. The next step for us is to create the initial quota database files and generate the disk usage tables. So create quota database, and there's of course a utility which performs this for us, so it isn't performed manually, and generate disk usage table. This will set up the initial database that will keep track of the usage, which will include the current usage on the /home file system. In other words, it defines a baseline. So defines baseline, the initial utilization of the system for all of the users of the system for the particular file system that is in question. The utility that assists us in carrying out this step is called quota check, and it's included with, of course, the quota RPM. So we'll run quota check, and we can, of course, confirm the path with the CUG options, which we can take a look at with help momentarily, pointing to the home file system. And this applies user and group quotas. So this will define, as mentioned, the database and generate the disk usage table. Let's go ahead and just do a which quota check. It's an SBIN and quota check. With the help option, we'll show the options that we're using. UG, check user and group respectively. C creates new quota files. So whenever you use the C option, you're generating new quota files. which sometimes in the event of quota database corruption is necessary. From time to time I've had that happen and have had to reset the system in single user mode and generate new usage tables and so on. Now, the generation of the database is a snapshot at a point in time, which of course is subject to change if a number of users are connected making changes, one or more of course. So let's go ahead and define our quota database with quota check. Again, this is a step that should typically be run in single user mode, but we trust in our classroom environment that no files that are important or any files are open at this particular point that have any consequence or bear any consequence on our environment. For production environment, perform these steps in single user mode and you'll avoid discrepancies in actual storage or actual utilization, actual consumption, and reported consumption. So let's quota check /home to see what can happen. And this reads that it cannot remount the file system read-only, so the counted values may not be right. Now there's the option to force checking, the M option. This needs to be turned on because, again, it is not able to remount it read-only because too many files are open. So there may be discrepancies, which means perhaps at some point we should reboot to single user mode and run quota check. Again, quota check should be run in single user mode or when the system is being initialized. Let's just note quota check should be run in single user mode or when the system reboots to facilitate read-only remount of target file system. So that's what is happening. And we'll just note, use the M option to override, which is what we've just done, which of course means the values may not be correct. But we trust that our values are correct because there's very little utilization on the system, which is why we're able to get away with it, to trust the values that are generated by quota check. Now that quota check has run successfully according to the exit status, we should check the quotas using quota check. It's basically a mini report. So for check defined quota database to see what the initial values are using the same tool, quota check. But this time, instead of with the C option to create, we'll use the A option with VUG to check verbosely users and groups. So checks quotas. Let's see what AVUG has to offer us, and of course we have to specify the file system. Otherwise, it will just check everything. Now notice it tells us here, quota check, your kernel probably supports journal quota, but you're not using it. Consider switching to a journal quota so that you can avoid running quota check after an unclean shutdown, so on and so forth. That takes advantage of journaling, and it reports the same problem when attempting to define the quota database, and that is problems concerning being able to remount the file system as read-only, so the values may be incorrect. This, of course, we're going to ignore because we know our utilization is low. So, scanning dev mapper home, check 97 directories and 129 files. So it has checked /home, and the database is intact. And whether or not it's accurate is a separate issue. Who gives us some insight into whether or not users are connected and are making changes. Again, you won't experience these problems in single user mode. So we've run quota check, and as far as the database is concerned, 97 directories and 129 files within the /home structure have been checked. A DU, for example, CHS or DU with just human readable of /home can give us some insight into the number of files and or directories and the total storage. So according to DU, 88 megabytes are in use, which seems to match somewhat the report of the 97 directories and 129 files. So far we've been forcing our options. Let's just ensure that we include in our notes the fact that we use M. And let's just note, forces check, despite not being able to remount the file system. Now that we know that we have a snapshot that's intact, that quota check can rely upon, at least as far as we're concerned, we need to assign quota policies on a per user basis or per group. So step 5 for us is to assign quota policies per user and or group. And there is a separate utility which handles this task, and it is edQuota, which allows us to edit the quota of various users. edQuota followed by the username. Now let's impose some limits on perhaps a user Linux CBT 4, for example. So edQuota Linux CBT 4 will propel us into the default editor. So uses default editor, which is defined in the editor variable. So if an undesirable editor surfaces, then you may want to set the editor variable to cause edQuota to use that editor. But nonetheless, it will propel you into the editor with a tabular form that can be manipulated to allow you to assign the quotas per user and or per group. So let's do a which edQuota. You'll see that, of course, it's a system binary that's available to the privileged user. And let's execute it for the user Linux CBT 4. Notice it propels us into the default editor VI. So these are the columns that are available. To influence this, let's quit. And let's echo the editor variable, may not be defined, which causes it to default to VI.